Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Introduction of Social Linguistic, second edition. This is done by Messery, Swan, Dumert, and Leap, and it was published by University Press. Language and Interaction. This chapter explores more of the social linguistic study of language, usage of social interaction, which draws on research traditions like interracial social linguistics, speaking ethnography, communication ethnography, and linguistic ethnography. In particular, interactional social linguistic is linked to pioneering work such as John Gumpress, and whose investigation of code switching in Norway you encountered into more of Chapter 5. But however, it is also employed more widely in quantitative social linguistic studies of language and interactions. Himes, whose idea of communicative competency greatly influenced ethnographic techniques, and Himes recommended using in-depth ethnographic reports of the varied ways of speaking, present in various cultures as a starting point for developing models in interplay between language and social life, or the meaning linkage between linguistic means and social meaning. Now, many studies, especially early studies, have been descriptive, nevertheless, in the study of language in interactional scholars. Scholars have also adopted a critical approach, and researchers have shown how language may be used to negotiate very unequal relationships between speakers, groups of speakers, or power that has been highlighted as a key feature in many, some would say most, interactions. Some scholars have taken a more interventionist posture, arguing that for modification of speaking behaviors in certain social circumstances using social linguistic data. Now, speaking and silence. Anthropologists have investigated the patterns of speaking and silence in many groups. Here, it's important to consider whether speaking and being silent are considered suitable in certain groups. The emphasis is on silence as something that has communicative meaning in addition to speech, rather than simply the absence of speech. In 1972, Basil discovered that people often kept their mouths shut when speaking to one another, including when meeting strangers, greeting children, or who had just returned from boarding school and when starting a relationship. These gatherings frequently include links between speakers that were vague or questionable in some way. He used the encounter of two guys working in a crew to round up livestock as an example of meaning between strangers. The following quote from Basil's informant, of who was also a crew member, now trying to speak more of the East Texas accent. He said, "One time I was with A, B, and X down at the Gleason Flat working cattle. That man X was from East Fork, which is a community nearly 40 miles from Seaboke, but where B's wives was from. But he didn't know. A never knew him before, I guess. First day I worked with X at night when we were camped, we talked about B, but X and A didn't say anything to each other. Same way second day, same way third. Then at night, one fourth day, we were sitting up in the fire and still X and A didn't talk. Then A said, 'Well, I know there is a stranger to me here, and I've been watching him, and I know he is all right.' And at that point, X and A talked a lot. And those two men didn't know each other, so they took it easy at first. Now, there's a Finnish proverb and saying on silence: listen a lot, speak little. One word is enough to make a lot of trouble. One mouth, 2 ears. A barking dog does not catch a hare, and a fool speaks a lot. A wise man thinks instead, brevity makes a good song. One word is as good as 9. Now, studies have documented silent societies, including those of Finns, Inuits, and various Native American tribes. And silent behavior is frequently regarded as noteworthy and as something that has to be explained, perhaps as a result of the Western influence and research communities' relative equality. Well, the Igbo people of Nigeria were known for their use of silence, which Noe describes as a distinctive kind of behavior. The Igbo place tremendous value on the skill of speaking. Even when greeting complete strangers, greetings are quite lengthy and complex. Noe contends that the Igbo people are known for their elementary loquacity. And as a contrast to the more chatty norm, silence in this situation is a significant form of behavior. It's used to manage emotionally charged events and relationships. In an effort to prevent silence, Tanan theorizes that a New York Jewish style of speech is characterized by certain traits. Now, the majority of the talking was done by New Yorkers, who were perceived by other participants as having dominated the conversation. But their discussion was characterized by the following traits. Now, first, there was a real fast rate of speech. There was a fast rate of turn taking, persistence, marking shifts in pitch. There was marked shifts in amplitude, preference of storytelling, preference of potential stories, and tolerance of preferences for simultaneous speech. But the non-New Yorker, on the other hand, might have been functioning under a distinct set of rules where people spoke less, yet expected their words to be taken seriously. Teneman analyzes her own research, as well as above-cited studies on speaking and silence. And in terms of politeness theory, she contends that quiet is frequently a sort of negative politeness, not intruding on others. Any civilization could experience this, but it wouldn't be noticed. However, silence can also be seen as a lack of positivity, of civility, by failing to meet the demands of others for involvement and attention. The research presented in this section emphasizes that not everyone interacts in the same way, and that discrepancies frequently have a cultural basis. And they pay attention to variances in speaking and behaviors between various cultures. And when conversing with others, we often provide particular versions of the facts and certain subjects or points of view and may be highlighted, downplayed, or silenced. Another element of conversation management is silence, specifically speaking pauses. For instance, short pauses can help to structure speaking turns, while longer pauses, even for a second or two, can have interactional significance. Culture to culture might differ in how often pauses or gaps in speech are used. Narratives. In this context, narratives encompass both formal storytelling performances and as well as a commonplace recounting of situations and events that permeate daily discussions. Some academians are fascinated by the content of narratives because they often serve as an only or most sensible accounts of specific events and are therefore important sources of data for anthropologists and social historians. Language scholars have frequently concentrated on elements of structure or form of narrative as well as the function of story and depiction of life experiences being encoded. Narrative can not be viewed as merely objective, factual description. Rather, they are always representations that the narrator has created in order to illustrate a particular point. And the decision made when telling a story allow narrators to judge other characters and events in the story, as well as portray themselves in a particular light. While it is possible for accounts to be ordered differently, Lebov claims that in practice the narrative structure always reflects the actual temporal sequence of events. For example, a boy punched me and I punched him, and the teacher came in to stop the fight. Well, narrative may contain additional elements LeBeau argues that a fully informative narrative may include the following: abstract, which summarizes the events; orientation, which identifies the setting; and the complicating actions, which is a series of clauses. Illustrated above, and the basic details of the storyline, and elevation, which indicates the story, the point of the story, or the reasons which the speaker thinks that the story. Okay? And then the results of resolution, which resolves the story. And there is the coda. The signals the end of the narrative and may bridge the gap between the narrative and the present time. Now, LeBeau was particularly interested in the assessment components that were present in his corpus of narratives, and he provided examples of a number of methods that narrators may be employed with their point to indicate how they wanted specific events to be perceived. Well, these included deviating from the narrative to comments on it, but it really was very great. Using specific linguistic strategies, like as repetition or quantifiers, such as all in, he had cuts all over, to intensify key parts of the story. Attributing certain emotions of a protagonist in the story. Mabin develops these concepts, and according to her, spontaneously occurring narratives are not self-controlled, like to be drawn from other stories, discussions from different contexts, and the interpersonal dynamics of the conversationists for their interpretations. Their narrative and the cultural values they reflect are both stressed by academics. Now, lastly, the immediate audience is crucial in any narrative. The narrator will consider even silent listeners while selecting how to tell a story. And listeners may be different, contribute to a narrative. A narrative may be provoked by something stated by another speaker. Now, conversational management. Sachs and colleagues concentrated on what they perceived as issues of those participating in regular, unstructured conversations. How do speakers know when a current turn was about to end? Or they could begin speaking since the order of a turn taking was not pre-specified, as it might be in a ceremony or a debate. And turns could be at any length. Why did the talk flow easily? Because succeeding speakers coordinated their conversational efforts. Now, according to Sachs and his entourage, his colleagues, they were transition relevant sites in every turn, areas where an utterance might have been finished. Syntactic cues and intonations were used to convey these. In a face-to-face conversation, nonverbal behavior, like eye contact and gesturing, would also be significant. But according to this turn-taking paradigm, only one person typically talks at a time. Any pauses between turns are brief, and any overlap in speech is minor and typically found near transitional places. These imply that the model is overly limited and most likely culturally particular. The use of the minimal responses sometimes refers to as the back-channel signals, and is one aspect that helps keep conversationists organized. Words like in English, yeah, and all right, are examples of minimal responses that are typically analyzed as conversational support from listeners rather than as speakers speaking turns in of themselves. Now, the one person at a time concept is put out by Sachs and her colleagues, has also been questioned by British researcher Jennifer Coates. Coates transcribed and examined a sizable corpus of casual communication among British women friends. She found it challenging to support the idea of an individual built speaking turn in her examination of this data because turns appear to be collaboratively created by speakers. But according to Coates, This type of speech is very cooperative, and she hypothesizes that female speakers use it more frequently. She discovered trends in a study of men's informal conversation that were more consistent with the one person at a time approach put forth by Sachs and colleagues. Now, up to this point, our attention has been on turn-taking behaviors and how it has been discovered. But these vary across speaker groups. Distinct social groups also utilize different modes of greeting, making requests, and exchanging information, among other conversational style elements. There are formal linguistic distinctions between some forms of Aboriginal English and the normative Australian English. For instance, the difference of pronunciation and grammar. Each contends that despite the employment of more conventional grammatical structures by Aboriginal English speakers, their language may nevertheless be significantly different from that of white Australians. Now, each discovered that using direct inquiries in Aboriginal English was subject to a number of restrictions to obtain orientational information, such as the clarification of a subject or confirmation of the date, time, the location of the event, and the questions may be utilized. In this instance, the inquiry typically took the form of a statement with a rising intonation. Well, you were in the pub, or Janie returned home, as opposed to, did Janie come home, and were you at the pub? Well, each contends that the speaker is delivering known or alleged information for the listener to affirm or deny. Such inquiries are an example of indirectness. Now, communication issues may arise as a result of a differing interactional styles used by Aboriginals and white Australian speakers. White speakers' adamant opinions may annoy Aboriginal speakers in settings like meetings and university tutorials on the other side, whilst white speakers may become irritated by the indirect and circumspect manner in which Aboriginal speakers choose to express themselves. Aboriginal speakers may make an effort to adapt in various speaking vocabularies, but they can also cause communication issues. The usage of gratuitous concurrence, and where the term like yes is employed, not necessarily to express agreement, but to insist the ongoing contact or speed at completion, is an example given by Eads. When utilizing instructional context, including police interviews, courtrooms, employment interviews, and medical consultations, classrooms and government meetings, direct questioning can have major repercussions and cause misconceptions when dealing with white Australia. Now, encoding relationships. While examples of study covered thus far have concentrated on the various conversational structures, it is also clear that these variations result in conversational outcomes, such as good or negative perception of various speakers or groups of speakers. And when someone speaks in a certain style, they're establishing a certain type of relationship with other people and revealing something about the kind of person they are by using a certain conversational style as well as an accent, a dialect, a language. Speakers are unavoidably performing some identity labor when they are conversing. Relationship between speakers and listeners can occasionally be expressed directly through language. And in several languages, speakers can indicate their relative rank by using specific forms of address. In English, these include terms like madam, sir, ma'am, first name, or term of endearment, calling somebody lovey and honey. And then asymmetrical talk. Such partnerships are frequently asymmetrical or uneven in that one speaker or groups of speakers has more influence than the other participants. The usage of phrases associated to status may show this. And the institutional circumstances of this topic have attracted the attention of many academics, such as hospitals and clinics, schools and colleges, police stations, law courts, and workplaces. The formal status of the speakers in these settings can be varied, and they can be doctor, patient, teacher, student, witness, witnesses, employer, employee, or have an impact on the participation in interaction. Based on the relative position, individuals may be anticipated to have more or less interactional rights. In such situations, the previous indicated the cultural disparities in interactional style, which intersect with status of influence, both the course of interaction and their outcomes, will also be significant. The analysis of doctor. You have doctor-patient conversations that's frequently demonstrated, and how such conversations reflect and uphold unequal power, the dynamics between the participants. According to Treischler and colleagues, that there are two subsequent interactions that are discussed. One involves a doctor and a patient, and the other involves a medical student and the same patient. Both exchanges were videotaped as part of a training program for the medical professionals. And the training program, in which the doctor is controlled, makes an effort to incorporate the psychosocial material into a medical framework. But the doctor explicitly finds that this is difficult to do. So the doctor consistently claims his medical voice, whereas the patient frequently combines this with the voice of the life world of everyday experiences, according to other studies. But when the medical student is left alone with the patient, he starts by expressing his curiosity about the pain, about the patient, and experiencing, and that his interactional approach differs from the doctors, that he is willing and allow relatively long pauses. By asking a question, he offers brief comments like, and yeah, urging the patient to talk more. Well, the doctor, the medical student, and the patient all have different statuses, which will have an impact on how they approach the consultation and how other participants respond to them. The fact that the patient is black and the doctor and the medical student are both white, as well as the fact that the patient is reliant on Social Security, are likely also pertinent. Our understanding of interactions is improved by the examination of the asymmetrical communication, both in terms of examination of how participants negotiate, perhaps shifting connections from one another, and how conversations are managed. For instance, the management of turn-taking. Such research, especially when done in institutional settings, may also have a focused effort. Now, in conclusion, sociologists or sociolinguistics have been interested in how language is used to commence in certain cultural situations, not just the language forms when analyzing language and interaction. Sociolinguistic study has focused on describing how various social groups use language, frequently drawing comparisons between people of various social classes, age groups, ethnic groups, and other groups. And the method has a risk of creating a relatively rigid idea of social identity. And in reality, speakers' allegiances are more likely to be fluid and variable. Numerous research on interactions have looked at situations where speakers from various cultural regions with various cultural perspectives engage. Focus has frequently been placed on the elements that contribute to the miscommunication, such as the speaker misunderstanding or differences in interpersonal communication styles that led to misunderstanding of what individuals mean. However, there are certain issues with the phrase miscommunication. It might indicate some neutrality, that misunderstanding just happened and have an equal impact on all speakers. And in reality, some speakers will be more negatively impacted than others. Miscommunication studies in institutional settings imply that those in less powerful positions may face substantial repercussions. Differences is interpersonal style may have an impact on whether a witness or defendant is believed in court, or whether a job applicant is hired or retrained. Researchers that studies these topics frequently want to have an impact on addition to merely analyzing and interpreting language interaction on speaking techniques.